In this video, I'm finally going to do my review of the Fujifilm X-E1. I've been curious about this camera for quite some time. I had never tried any of the cameras that had the first X-Trans sensor. So besides exploring the differences in the sensor technology, I also wanted to try out the X-E line of cameras. I had never really used one before. The most time I had spent with one was a few minutes at a camera store holding one of the X-E line cameras, and that's it. So it was going to be, I knew it was going to be an interesting experiment challenge for me to try one of these cameras out. I knew I was going to like the compact size. There was no doubt about that. What was going to be the interesting part about it was trying out the rangefinder style of design. So I picked this up, I think in June, May or June, and the main purpose was to have something compact to travel with so I wouldn't have to bring my X-H1, and this fit that bill perfectly. I took it on a trip across the country in June, and that worked out perfectly. I don't want to get too deep into the specs of this camera and its history. I think there's a ton of videos talking about that, and that's easy to find the information. So I'll give you my pros and cons about this camera, and then I'll just give you some general thoughts about it and how it fits into what I've tried so far. I'll give you the cons of this camera first. The first con on this list, and this is in no particular order, is that this has less customizable buttons than the cameras that were released after it. This is not a huge deal for some people, but I've become really used to customizing these Fujifilm cameras. And even if it's just a handful of buttons, rearranging a handful of buttons, or customizing which button pulls up my ISO if the camera doesn't have an ISO dial, or which button pulls up my saved film simulation recipes. Customizations like that are really, really handy. This doesn't have as many buttons that you can customize as some of the other cameras. So that was something that I had to get used to when I was setting up this camera to how I like it. The EVF is good, but it does have a little bit of a lag compared to what I'm used to. The size of it wasn't a huge deal for me, so I wouldn't say the size is a negative. Just the performance and responsiveness is what I would say is the more noticeable downfall of this EVF, again, compared to the others that I've owned or I've tried. The biggest negatives of this camera for me, as far as actually using it, all have to do with focusing, both manual focus and autofocus. So first let's talk about autofocusing. There's a noticeable performance difference between this and the cameras with the X-Trans 2 and X-Trans 3 sensors for me. In a few different scenarios. Some lenses that are slow to autofocus in the Fuji lineup are even more noticeably slower on this camera. For example, my Pancake 27mm lens is really slow on this camera compared to some of the other cameras. And it gets even worse in low light scenarios. And I'm not talking about continuous autofocus. I'm talking about single point focus and single shot focus. Very relatively simple scenarios. That really kind of surprised me how much of a difference there was. So that took a little bit of getting used to. If I was in a low light scenario and I was using one of those slow focusing lenses like the 27mm, I would almost be better off just manually focusing. So that performance difference is definitely noticeable. So if you rely heavily on autofocus, not even just continuous, but just quick, snappy, single shot, single point autofocus, it's something to keep in mind that there is a noticeable speed difference between this and the cameras that were released after. With the cameras with the X-Trans 2 and 3. Another beef about autofocus is even when you're not on single or continuous, which when you're on these, the autofocus responds is activated when you half press the shutter button overall, that if you're in a well lit situation with a fast focusing lens, like in the middle of the day with, like, say, one of the compact primes, weather resistant compact primes, it's relatively snappy and it's fine, and the autofocus indicators light up as you expect them to. But one negative that really bugs me is when I'm on manual focus on the switch here, and I use the back button autofocus to focus to autofocus on things on occasion. The box that indicates your focus point doesn't light up to confirm that you're on that you locked in focus. It lights up when you're on single and continuous, but not when you're on manual using back button autofocus. And that's not the case with any of the other Fuji cameras I've tried. They all the box or the autofocusing point indicator in the viewfinder or on the screen, they light up, giving you visual feedback that you've locked on focus. So that takes a little bit of getting used to. That means that if I really want to know, I have to pay attention to the lens stopping and locking in, or turn on the indicator sound, which I have on now. I have a manual focus lens on there right now, so I can't demonstrate that scenario. But it's definitely something that is a true negative of this camera for me. So both autofocus performance and back button autofocus are less than stellar for me on this camera. Okay, so let's talk about manual focus. Obviously, the beauty about manual focus is that you don't need to rely on the camera at all. If you are comfortable with the way that the lens focus ring works and you take your time, then the manual focus experience is as good as the lens is and as good as you are. Now, what we've come to expect, though, is some help from the camera in terms of focus peaking or other focus assist tools like zooming in, focus peaking, like I said, or the focus prisms the digital focus prisms that some of these newer cameras have, that mimic the old style focusing screens on film cameras. All those are really strong and useful tools to help you get good manual focus on these cameras. So the negative in terms of this manual focusing aspect is that the focus peaking choices on here are either on or off pretty much. There's no color choices, and the color that they are just white, and they're very, very faint, and oftentimes it takes you a while to even find where the focus peaking is at in the image itself. And if you shoot a lot of black and white like I do, and you're seeing black and white in the viewfinder on the screen, it becomes even harder because oftentimes that's blending in with the image pretty well. So it's hard to find the focus peaking elements. The other negative is, besides the focus peaking, you only have the zoom in to check focus feature. And right now on this camera, on the way I have this set up, I have that activated to this wheel, to the button on this wheel. So when I press in the button, it zooms in, and then I can dial in the focus exactly where I want it. So having that on that wheel does make this manageable, and I can use manual focus lenses like that on this camera relatively well. I'm not as fast with it as I would be on my X-E1 or some other cameras. The other thing is, if I have an autofocus lens from Fujifilm on there, say the 35mm f2, let's say, and I decide, well, I want to manually focus this lens on my X-E1, as soon as I start turning that focusing ring, it zooms in for me. I can have it set up that way anyways. So as soon as I start turning that ring, it zooms in for me. It recognizes, oh, he's manually focusing. Let's give him something to help out with that. So that's a really nice feature that I've gotten used to with those lenses. And when those lenses are mounted on here, it doesn't do that. And I'm pretty sure there's no way to turn that on. I've looked through it, and I don't think there's a newer firmware update than what I have installed on here. Maybe there's a way to make that happen. If there is, you guys can let me know. That's another aspect of the manual focusing of this camera that was a little bit of a letdown. The last negative I'll talk about has nothing to do with how you use it and the results of this camera or the image quality or anything like that. The last negative is the price. And if this was the only if only this camera existed and let's say a Leica existed, the camera for the price, this would probably win out, hands down. But the fact that this lives in a group of Fujifilm cameras that are anywhere from 9 to 4 years old now, they all kind of land within $300 of each other. That's a lot of money for some people, but considering this starts at $250, and you can do a stair step from that point and get a different camera model almost every $50 increments, or maybe even $100 increments if you stretch it a little bit. So I don't think this camera, at least from my experience and what I found online, I don't think it's so cheap that it's a gimme, so to speak, that it's an obvious one to pick because of price. I think it's priced so closely to the X-E2, to the X-T10, to a handful of other cameras that it makes the decision a little difficult to pick this one over those. Maybe we can do a separate video on choosing a used Fujifilm camera, but I would say if your budget is $250 to $400, let's say, I'd say really do your research and take your time searching and find the camera with the features that you're going to want. Okay, so let's talk about some of the specific pros. I think there's a lot of great things about this camera, and a lot of the great things are kind of general aspects of it. But the specific pros that I have written down here are solid image quality. I say solid because I don't think, especially now with everything else that's out, I don't think this hits any home runs in any specific area of image quality. The megapixel count is the same as the X-Trans 2. The sensor, the X-Trans 1 versus the X-Trans 2 are very, very, very similar in terms of what you actually see. I think they might have a slight color difference when set to the same white balance, but they're very, very, very similar. And the image quality out of this is solid and really good, a really good image quality for the money. So that's definitely in the pros column. Just overall, a really, really impressive image quality. And I would put this up against any $250 DSLR that you might get from the used Canon or Nikon market for sure. The design and ergonomics are awesome. I mean, if you know you like the rangefinder style, or if you want to give it a shot, I mean, to get that vibe, to get that design for $300 ish, it's pretty awesome. Considering like in the film world, or even outside of the Fuji landscape, it's very difficult to get the rangefinder design, compact rangefinder style design for this price range. So these are great options for someone to get into a rangefinder style camera in an affordable way. And a lot of these classic street photographers that we're all inspired by used Leicas, which were actually rangefinders. And one of the biggest benefits they always talk about, especially Joel Meyerowitz, he talks about having having one eye free for people that are right eye dominant. That is, having one eye free makes it so you're more welcoming, you're less intimidating to people on the street that you may be photographing. Also, that if you want to, you can kind of keep this eye open at the same time they're looking through here, and even have a little bit of an extra view of what's going on before the subject enters the frame, or before whatever happens in the frame happens, you can kind of get an idea what's going on outside the camera. And then even besides the fact that it's a rangefinder style, the ergonomics are pretty nice. I like it. This little ridge here on the other opposite end of the camera of the rangefinder of the viewfinder has a perfect place to kind of to grip and for your thumb to kind of sit. So that's really nice. I'm a huge fan of back button autofocus when I can use one. That button's there, although I've been trying to use this manual focus lens on here a lot anyways. But still, the ergonomics are pretty solid. It has a nice shutter sound. Let me cue it up here. So that sounds pretty nice. It does have the function button on top, which I have set now to ISO. So I have, you know, obviously my shutter speed, aperture, and now my ISO pretty close, you know, to where my hands are sitting. So I can move relatively fast when I'm out and about shooting with this. So along with the design, the weight feels nice. It's not too heavy, but it has a really good balance to it. In general, overall, I've enjoyed taking pictures with this camera. I really like the images that I've achieved with this. Overall, it's a great camera. Besides the photo samples in this video already, here is a printed shot that I took on the trip that I was telling you about. And this is just outside of a plane window, but because of the setting and the vibe and where my seat was and the angle that I had and the clouds and all these aspects, it turned out to be one of my favorite photos I've taken recently. And it was on this camera. I think this was the 27mm pancake lens on the camera at the time. I was also kind of really testing that lens out at the same time, and that image is, like I said, it's one of my recent favorites, and that was on this camera. Obviously, like, that picture could have been taken with a lot of cameras, especially my Fujifilm cameras, but this was extremely capable. I had the camera with me. I felt confident enough in the camera to have it be my only camera that I took with me, that and 2 lenses, and it worked out great. Would I recommend this camera to other people? Well, I would say it's a very capable camera. If you have this camera, or if you're really eyeballing this camera specifically, I say go for it. The image quality is great. Just know its limitations with focusing and with autofocusing, and know the drawbacks of using a manual focus lens on there. But you're going to get great image quality. And I think one thing I will say is that you can't ignore how close this is priced to the X-E2. On MPB, KEH, and Use Photo Pro didn't have either of these the last time I checked. But the price is close enough that personally I would still choose the X-E2 over this one. And I'll go over a lot of the specific reasons in another video. But a lot of it has to do with the focusing tools, both the autofocus performance, but also the really improved focus peaking and the other manual focus assist tools that those cameras have included. There's a handful of other features, though, that would make me choose the X-E2 over this one. But like I said, if the price was wider, I would say go for this. Go for this. It's worth the money. And if you do see one that's $100 to $200, where you're seeing $150 to $200 difference between the two cameras, then this is definitely a great one to consider. But I just see a lot of these cameras priced so closely together that it doesn't make the decision quite so easy. But many of you may have this camera already or are about to get it. And like I said, it is a great camera, just like almost all the Fujifilm cameras in the lineup. Having tested the X-Trans 1, 2, and 3 sensors out relatively extensively now, I can say I don't see anything in the X-Trans 1 and X-Trans 2 sensor that would make me choose them over the X-Trans 3 for my only camera. If I only had to have one camera, it would still be something with the X-Trans 3 sensor. Personally, I just like everything about that sensor more than these. And these are great, but I don't think these offer anything specific, anything unique, anything magical, as some people have said, that make it worth choosing these over that if price is relatively equal. But keep in mind, and this goes for any camera that you may own, or at least most cameras that people can own out there, but especially for the Fujifilm cameras. If you're using the camera constantly and you're getting great results, that's the key to making all these other cameras and all these comparisons kind of just disappear and go away. Because if you're using the tool you have and you're creating cool stuff, then really who cares what model it is and what year it was built and what logo's on the front and how many megapixels and all that stuff. Once you choose the camera and you figure out the camera that's going to inspire you to shoot, and you start creating with it on a regular basis and you're happy with it, that's the biggest key for you to be able to ignore all this noise and all this other stuff and just make cool stuff. And even if another camera is out there that's technically better on paper, you're not going to care, because you and your camera are going to be out shooting and creating stuff, and that's it. That's the most important thing. But even if we don't go over technical specs and all this stuff in reviews like this, I feel my biggest responsibility is to at least highlight the big things, the big key takeaways. And like I said, for me, it's a great camera, but I think it's too closely priced to cameras that I would choose over this. And that might be the case for you. You just have to do a little more research. The X-Trans 1 sensor is great, but in my mind, it's not better than the X-Trans 2 and X-Trans 3. The improvements on those are worth the extra costs for me. But this is a fantastic photographic tool. I'm still debating. I might keep this around with a manual focus lens on it, just as a fun camera to play around with, something to throw in the bag and keep with me a lot of the times. I'm not sure quite yet, but we'll see. It's been fun to shoot with regardless. So I think that's it for now. I hope some of this has been helpful. If you guys are considering this camera, let me know. We can kind of have a discussion about this versus the X-E2 and some other cameras in the lineup. And give me your thoughts too on the choices that we have right now in these price ranges. So I appreciate every one of you guys. You guys have been awesome. And just like always, I'll talk to you soon.